I'm now going to ask us all to look into our crystal balls, because, you know, as we speak, we're only 2 to 3 weeks after the emergency budget. We have an autumn statement, we have a pre-budget, and then next year's budget. And as you alluded to earlier, Eric, that top rate may not be there in 4 or 5 years' time. Obviously, we'll see where that goes. But this government has a lot more budgets to deliver. What should people be looking out for over the next few years, do you think, Amanda?
I think, well, it's a coalition budget, so there was give and take on both sides, and I think that as the new government beds in, I think that in the future we will probably be looking at a reduction in that higher rate of income tax. I think that they probably will go back to the original pledge and look at inheritance tax again. Whether or not it is as straightforward as sometimes portrayed in the media of, you know, we're going to have a £1 million nil rate band in the future, I don't think it's necessarily going to be as straightforward as that. I think that they'll probably tinker with it slightly and link in possibly properties in some way, so that one's principal private residence may potentially be exempt or partially exempted perhaps up to a certain limit. But I think that additional assets, other properties may well still fall into that trap. Whole range of things that could be brought in, lot of discussion pre-budget as to what was going to happen with inheritance tax. So I think that they probably will revisit that at some point.
Do you think they'll make it gentler rather than harder?
I think so, but I don't think that we're just going to have this flat rate of everything under £1 million is exempted. I think that they're going to look at other options there.
Under the previous government, there's a lot of talk that inheritance tax was a voluntary tax. Roy Jenkins, didn't he? Called it a voluntary tax that people only pay where they dislike their heirs more than they dislike the government.
Absolutely
and
spot on.
And there's an element of truth in that. Certainly for the wealthier people, it is voluntary. And there's been a lot of questions about whether that should stop and they should make it more aggressive.
That's right. I think that they probably will ease up on it. I think they'll do other things as well. I think that they'll look at certain levels of equality and looking at not just spouse exemptions, but possibly for those who are cohabiting as well. I think that they'll probably address those sorts of issues perhaps.
I think there's a time bomb waiting, I think, unless they do something like that, because my generation, for instance, has benefited from an explosion in house prices. I don't necessarily think that will happen again, and therefore the young generation, the people who are now in their early 20s, are going to struggle much harder to get themselves onto the housing ladder. And one way to deal with that is inherited wealth. For me to be able to pass on my house to my children without an inheritance tax hit, that will kind of soften the blow, that they may not benefit in the same way from house price.
It could become, I mean, from everything you've said, it could become quite a political hot potato for more people than one would traditionally bracket into the inheritance tax sort of interest area.
Yes, and with an ageing population, how do we fund care of the elderly? So whether or not that's done through insurance policies or a whole range of different measures that could be brought in, but I think that that whole issue is going to have to be addressed. And you know, you just look at the discussions over the last couple of weeks with regard to age of retirement and that having to be increased. I think the same thing is going to be done in terms of personal wealth, looking to see how much of that we fund ourselves.
I'm more of a doomsayer on this, so I apologise for that. And whilst in the future it's kind of shorter term, I look closely at markets as you'd expect, and I see some huge problems coming up. This idea of double-dip recession in our country, in the States, China's growth is slowing down. Markets are responding to that right now. The one thing clients should be doing now is protecting their assets. So put guarantees, get guarantees of investments. I think there's some huge clouds on the short-term horizon of our economy, and I don't think we're just mildly now coming out of recession. I think there's a lot more to come.